You are listening to presentations by Michael Albert of Z Magazine and Professor Noam Chomsky of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology at a panel on Building a Society from Below on March 16, 2009 at Building 34, Room 101 at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the United States. The event was sponsored by the Boston and New York consulates of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and was recorded under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike License 2009 by Jason Pramis for Open Media Boston, www.openmediaboston.org.
Okay. The next speaker is going to be Michael Albert, who's probably doesn't need that much introduction, but he's going to be talking to us about participatory economics and some other thoughts on the topic of making a better society from below. Thank you.
Whatever you want.
Okay?
Whatever you want.
Okay.
It's your choice.
Thank you very much for having me at this event. It's a pleasure for all sorts of reasons, coming back to MIT and speaking here. I went here many, many years ago, and being here with people who I very much admire also. I actually met Julio Chavez in Venezuela. I interviewed him there, sat in his mayor's office, and was impressed, very impressed, to talk to a mayor, that is a person who occupied a position of power, about how he wanted to, and it was clearly demonstrated that he was indeed trying to diminish and reduce and even dissipate his own power, and instead elevate the power of the constituencies where he was. When we talk about building a new society from below, for me, and this is going to sound a little odd, I think, you have to think about it, Julio Chavez is an argument for that because he's almost unique. There are very, very few mayors, very, very, very few people who occupy positions of power who are interested in reducing their own power, diminishing and eliminating their own power, and passing it on to other people. He's an incredibly rare person, and we cannot bank on having too many more Julio Chavez's, although we should take pleasure that we have one. The title is Building a New Society from Below, and it raises, for me, two kinds of issues, or two broad strands of issues. One is, well, what's the new society that we're going to build? And the other is, what are the building blocks? How do we do this building? And the two strands are intimately connected, and regrettably they're both very large topics, which couldn't be covered in hours, much less minutes. But let me try and say at least a little bit about both sides of this issue. What kind of new society? Let me just mention a few things that I think should characterize, and that I hope and I believe the Bolivarian movement also thinks should characterize, though I can't speak for that, a new society. Classlessness. What does that mean? It means that people are not divided into categories of groups that have an interest that's contrary to one another, where one dominates another. We don't want a situation in which we have a new society and we just have a different kind of boss. We have a different kind of layer of power above most people. We don't want that. We want classlessness. We want real people's power. That being the case, we have to make some changes, some obvious changes. We have to do more than this, but we have to make some obvious changes. We can't have 2% of the population own all the productive assets. We can't have people who, by virtue of a deed in their pocket, are worth more, have more wealth than millions of other people. And that's the case now. Bill Gates is probably worth more than the population of Norway's assets, I'm guessing, but I wouldn't be surprised. We can't have that. That much is pretty much agreed by everybody on the left, every anti-capitalist. I want to suggest another part of a vision that would be a worthy, a desirable, a valuable society. And that's that we also can't have a layer of people who monopolize not property, but conditions of work that are empowering, that give them confidence, skills, knowledge, access to decision making, while the rest of the population does rote, tedious, and obedient work and is therefore subordinate. So even if we deal with this property problem, there's a second issue to deal with, a division of labor problem, a situation of about now 20% of the population monopolizing that which contributes to, Julio mentioned knowledge, that and its skills and confidence and time, that which contributes to being able to participate. Having formal participation, in which 20% totally dominate everything that happens, doesn't solve the problem of participation. You need people to be able to participate, to be armed, equipped, confident, have time, skills, and information. So that's the second thing that we need to characterize a desirable new society. Okay, so what does this say institutionally? It's nice to talk about sort of aspirations, but it doesn't mean anything without institutions. So I just want to suggest a couple. I don't have a lot of time, and then talk about maybe some strategic implications. One is we get rid of private ownership. It's got to go. We can't have people who own mines, vast plantations, Microsoft, General Motors, equipment, capital assets. We can't have a few people who own that and who profit off it and who as a result are richer than kings used to be. Can't have that, so we get rid of that. We have a situation where people's influence is a function of people's power, not property. It's a function of the fact that they participate. But nor can we have the division of labor. So we have to do something new. And it seems to me that what we have to do is something like divide up work differently. Suppose this was a workplace, and we examined it, and we discovered that 20%, a third of that column over there, dominated all the decisions, had way more wealth, had way more income, completely was the dominant class in our organization, and the rest of us were subordinate. And we discovered that each morning they eat a chocolate bar and the rest of us don't. And the nutritionist told us that chocolate generates skill, confidence, and knowledge, and the absence of chocolate is deadening and debilitating. And I asked, okay, what do we do to fix it? It wouldn't take a genius. In fact, it would take a 6-year-old to figure out we redistribute the chocolate. Everybody has to have a fair share of the chocolate. Okay, well, the next step is not hard. What gives those 20 people, 20% dominance, is that they do work and have positions and have situations that empower them, that give them confidence, that give them knowledge, that make them, if we all come together in a meeting, right, ready, able to participate. It makes them set the agenda. It makes them have all the arguments. The best we can do is vote with or against some of them. They rule. So what do we have to do? We have to redistribute the tasks which are empowering. We have to change the division of labor so that we all have a comparable amount of empowering work and of rote and tedious work. So in other words, we not only are redistributing property, or at least getting rid of private property, we're getting rid also of the monopoly on empowering work. And we're doing this to attain classlessness. One last point about vision. I usually talk for an hour or two on vision. One last point about vision. You can't have markets and have classlessness. It doesn't mean that we're going to get rid of markets in 20 minutes, or tomorrow, or the next day. There was a time when people were opposed to slavery. There were abolitionists, but there was slavery around. When they said, I'm an abolitionist, it didn't mean that they thought that it was going to disappear in 20 minutes. It meant that they thought it had to go. It had to disappear. Because it intrinsically destroyed what they believe in. Markets intrinsically, by their very logic and operation, produce class division. It isn't just private property that does that. Because markets create, this would take a little time, but markets create an environment in which is not only antisocial, you must compete to get ahead. Nice guys finish last. You must be antisocial to progress. But they also create an environment in which you must cut costs. You must compete. And the way you do that is by, in essence, oppressing yourself. what's the implications of this? And I'll make what I just said a little more clear when I do the implications. What's the implications of some of this strategically? Well, what's strategy? What does it mean build a society from below? Whether one has somebody in the White House, to use the U.S. analogy, who's on your side, or one doesn't. Regrettably, we don't, but one could imagine the possibility that we did, I suppose. In fact, that might be a good exercise in a minute. Well, strategy is you pick fights. You fight over things that you want to win. You try and win changes, reforms. You organize together. So one part of strategy is, well, what do you fight over? And how do you fight over it? You fight over that which will improve people's lives. There are many people on the left who think to fight over wages, to fight over affirmative action, to fight over something less than the millennium is to sell out. That's false. That's completely wrong. People's lives depend on these things, on ending wars, on winning more wages, on changing things now. So you fight to win these gains in the present, but you do it in a way that is oriented toward reaching your long-term goals. You do it in a way in which you discuss it and you organize for it, and what you're doing leaves your constituency larger, more powerful, more committed, and desiring more in the future. That means that you talk about things in a particular way. Let's take an example of the current crisis. We have an economic crisis. Without going into big details, if we cut it down to the simplest point, we live in a sick and peculiar world in which crazy systems operate. Capitalism is one of those crazy systems. We were not hit by an asteroid, right? The world's productive capability has not gone downhill in the last year. The exact same potential exists in people and in technologies as existed before. So what's the matter? What's the matter is that when something causes, and it could be any number of things, and so we don't even have to discuss the details, when something causes it to hiccup, the hiccup can spread. If something causes a large hiccup, a large disruption of the operations of this system, it can cause unemployment and dislocation and the diminishment of the value of certain assets, which then ripple into other groups and other people and other owners and cause them to cut back on what they're doing, to change their policies in a pattern which leads after a while to a crisis. How does the mainstream think about such a crisis? And sadly, I think most people on the left, we think about it as, let's get out of the crisis. Let's get back to where we were before. Now, it's not that getting back to where we were before is worse than going downhill. It's better. But it's not a very ambitious program. Suppose we thought a little differently. Suppose we thought, instead of thinking, what can we do to stimulate the economy, to prod activity back so that the ripples are dissipated and the economy is working normally again, what can we do that is to the advantage of working people? What they do is they think, what can we do to get back into shape, but to the advantage of the rich and powerful? Or at least not significantly hurting them in total. Some of them are going to get hurt. But we want to be absolutely sure, Obama and all the rest of them, we want to be absolutely sure that we don't move in a manner which is going to reapportion things so that when we come out of it, working people are stronger, capital is weaker, wealth is redistributed, power is redistributed. But you can imagine all sorts of ways to fix this thing that would have positive effects. So let's say unemployment is rising and you want to do something about it. Well, it could be rising tremendously, and you could say that all capitalist firms have to pay all of their workers for 40 hours work, but only doing 30. And then they have to hire the unemployed to make up the difference. Why is that bad? What's the bad in that? Well, it's good for the people who are now working 30 hours to earn 40 hours pay. It's great for them. The people who are unemployed are now getting hired because they have to be hired because otherwise you don't have enough work getting done. And they're getting 40 hours paid for 30 hours work, so they're ecstatic. Who's it bad for? It's bad for the owners. Because the owners now are paying a third more than they were paying before in salaries. And their profits have gone to hell. Now, if you don't do anything, if you don't make another demand, what happens is they go on a capital, they stop. They say, no, it's no good. That's that ripple effect. The profits are too low, so I'm going to turn off my machines. So what's the next thing that you would do? You'd have to demand that that's not an option. Any capitalist who decides not to operate, despite having low profits, loses his workplace. Not because we're nationalizing as an act of, whatever, but because it's a punishment. Because you're not serving the population. Because you're not working to get... And so you can imagine, in other words, making demands and conceiving of those demands in a way that's designed to alleviate pain, but also to increase the power of the people's power, of the population. To increase the power of working people. Now that's a big one, but you can imagine very small ones too. You can imagine talking about things in a different way. Not that long ago up at Harvard, up the river, there was a strike for the wages of campus police. And students supported it. One of the students called me and said, he was a very radical student, he said, my God, I know that I have to support the campus police who want to beat the hell out of me in their demand for higher wages. But it just seems ludicrous for me to be spending my time doing that. How is it furthering the revolution? How is it doing any... And what I said was, well, I don't know. What if you said, for example, that you want a campus-wide discussion of why the campus police earn less than professors earn? In other words, you didn't just talk about a 10% increase or a 20% increase. You said, let's talk about why people earn what they earn. Why do the professors who work in very cushy conditions and have very pleasant circumstances and have quite fulfilling labor earn more than the people who clean their offices? What's the moral there? What's the value there? And we support the demand of the campus police for higher wages, and we also support that the entire wage structure of the university should come under consideration, and that we should consider what's good and what's not. You can imagine doing demands in a way that raises ideas that are associated with going further, moving towards something new. I think we don't do this most of the time, honestly, because we don't really believe you can win. We don't really think about winning something new, because deep down we really doubt that it's possible. So all we think about is alleviating the most egregious pain, not getting to something new. What's an implication for our organizations or our movements? Suppose we want classlessness. Well, let's take something more simple that people know about. Suppose we don't want racism in a new world. Suppose we want a new world which has multiculturalism, which has diverse cultures, with all mutually respectful, and without racism. What's the implication for our movements? Well, one, we should make demands that move in that direction. But two, our movements should not be racist. It's pretty simple. Our movements should internally reflect that desire. If we want classlessness, our movements should not be class-divided movements. They should not be classist movements. They should not be movements whose tone and tenor is dismissive of working people. Movements which denigrate everything that working people do, and which elevate that which the 20% of highly educated people do. That's not a way to build a successful movement that's going to overcome class division. We should have movements in which we treat income the way we believe it should be treated. Most movements in the United States, if they have a dues structure at all, the dues structure is less progressive than the U.S. income tax structure. Right? It doesn't even occur to anybody that the people who earn more should pay more. That the people who earn a lot should pay a lot into the movement and support it more. That the movement should redistribute wealth internally. It doesn't. Movements in the United States often tend to talk and speak and write in a manner that is designed to appeal to professors in postmodernism classes. not to communicate with people about real substance, but to show off, what's the word, erudition? I don't even know how you say it. To show off their learning. These might sound like trivial things, but when you're trying to build a movement, the issue is having enough people from below who can make change. In the United States, we need 100 million people on our side. 100 million people on our side. That's what we have to be thinking about. We have to be thinking about how do you build a movement that is ultimately going to reach out at that level, that ultimately takes care of people, empowers people, gives people spirit and hope, gives people participation in its own structures and in society sufficient to have that kind of scope and range. So there are many implications for the organization of a movement, for its internal self-management, for its democracy, for its participation, rather than replicating. Our movement institutions, our media institutions, some of them have divisions of labor, even ownership relations, decision-making relations that barely differ from Newsweek or Time. That doesn't make any difference. That's as if we had a movement organization that was like a southern slave plantation on race, or that was like the Playboy Mansion on gender. That's how bad it is. People don't see it, but that's really how bad it is. If our movement embodies the class structure, the class relations, the class attitudes that we say we're against, it puts the lie to what we're doing. Here's another implication. One of the things a movement can do is build, as is happening in Venezuela, the infrastructure of the new society. Even when you're just beginning, even now, we can be doing that in the United States. We can be creating small, because we don't have the kinds of assets yet, small institutions which attempt to embody our values, which attempt to manifest the desires we have for a new society, to learn from as an experiment, to meet needs, etc. One of the institutions that people do to do that is called a co-op, of which Venezuela is creating tons of co-ops. There are many co-ops in the United States. Here's a place where an understanding of vision can have a profound effect on what you're doing, and even why and how you're doing it. So, most of the time when people go to form a co-op, this is what they have in mind. I want a workplace that's just. I want a workplace that's democratic. I want a workplace that's equitable in the way it distributes assets. And so, in Argentina, say, when many workers take over many factories and they set them up as co-ops, they decide, well, we'll elect the officials, we'll tend to equalize the incomes and the wages, and we will begin to take care of ourselves and so on. And they have tremendous aspirations and values, and they're wonderful people. I sat in a room in Argentina with 50 representatives from 50 occupied factories a couple of years ago. And they wanted me to talk, and I said, no, let's go around the room first and have people present their stories. And they started. And after about 5 of them, the very happy environment in the room had turned rather depressed. And after about 10 of them, people were crying. And the reason was because person after person was saying, I don't know how the mood was established that you could just lay out on the table your fears and but person after person was saying, you know, we took over the workplace, we equalized the wages, we instituted voting for the managers and for the, and it was wonderful. And it's 6 months later, and all the old crap is returning. And I'm beginning to wonder if Margaret Thatcher wasn't right, was how one of the most eloquent persons said it. And so, after a while, I spoke and I said, you know, I think the issue here isn't human nature, which is what they thought. It isn't some kind of rule or law of social relations, which imposes hierarchy back on us. We can escape it for a month or two, but then it comes back. It's that you made a change, but you left some things that corrupted what you were doing. You did tremendously important and valuable changes, but you left the old division of labor. You left it the case that 20% were doing all the empowering stuff. I spoke in one factory to a woman who was doing the financial books. Before, she had been working in front of a glass furnace all day long, doing absolutely rote work. I was talking to her, and she was doing the finance books now, and I said, what was the hardest thing? I mean, you were doing that, now you're doing this. What was the hardest thing? And she was sort of bashful and didn't really want to answer. She knew it was a question that reflected well on her. I kept pushing, and I said, was it to learn how to do accounting? How to keep the records? She said, no, that really wasn't the hardest. That wasn't so hard. Was it to learn how to use the computer that you have to use, and the spreadsheets, and keep track of that? She said, no, actually, that wasn't the hardest thing. I didn't know what. So I said, well, okay, then what was the hardest thing? She said, well, first I had to learn to read. So this woman, who didn't know how to read, and was doing nothing except tending the furnace, was now doing the job that previously was done by the PhD accountant, running the books of the factory. But here's the rub. She was doing it. And now she was monopolizing it. And of course it was a gigantically inspiring story. But still, the situation was re-emerging that she was, and other people who were occupying these positions by themselves, while there were still people who were just working in front of the furnaces, the former group were beginning to dominate the latter group. And so we talked about it, and talked about how if they had gotten rid of the division of labor, how if they had redistributed not just the incomes, which were now reverting back, but the job positions, it would have been a different story. And then we talked about how the market was coercing them as well, how the market was forcing them to cut back air conditioning, to get rid of the daycare that they initially introduced, to speed up when they initially tried to make the pace of work sane. The market was forcing them to undo all of that, and they didn't all want to do it. Only the sort of more brutish ones, who were insulated from the effects, wanted to do it. So they made managers who would make those harsh decisions that would affect everybody else. Between the market and the division of labor, their tremendously inspiring transformation of their workplace was being undone. And so my point is that understanding what we want and understanding something about its features isn't just a pie-in-the-sky exercise, an interesting intellectual exercise for the future. But it tells us things which bear upon what we do right now. How we organize ourselves now, what demands we make now, what we do when we're constructing infrastructure now, etc. Let me give one example from Venezuela. Although that co-op example, I think, probably applies in some sense in Venezuela. But there's another issue in Venezuela that I've had trouble with and I've been thinking about. In Venezuela, it's incredible. You go down there and you look at the newspapers, and you can't find an article that isn't anti-Chavez in the newspapers. It's just incredible. You can look at an article that's about baseball. Venezuela is, baseball crazy. You can look at an article that's about baseball, and they've got to find a way to smash Chavez in the article. I mean, everything in the newspapers, contrary to what people think in the U.S., which is that in the U.S. they think, well, the newspaper is written by Chavez. That's the only way it could possibly be that he's the president. It's the exact opposite. The newspaper is written by people who literally are psychotically opposed to Chavez. I mean, it's mind-boggling. So the question arises, what's Chavez? What is the Bolivarian movement doing with this? Because it does have an effect. And I think we need to understand this. After 10 years of the Bolivarian Revolution, in the recent election, it was only 55-45. It should have been 70-30. Or 80-20, I think, after 10 years. 10 years should have inspired a bigger movement, should have empowered a bigger movement, should lead to more and clearer, widespread understanding. So the question is, why not? It seems to me the reasons why not are very complex. It's because in Venezuela they're trying to create a new world without a battle. I mean a violent battle. They're trying to create it via a dialogue, via a debate and a discussion and participation. It is an incredibly exemplary act. The harmful part is that they're trying to create it largely on the back of some leaders who are pulling along the population, hoping that the population, like Julio was doing, trying to get the population to take over his role. I think probably the absence of a vision of what media should be like, newspapers should be like, in a good society, has interfered with the capacity of the Bolivarian Revolution to propose something for media. They don't want to appear like they are anti-free speech. They do not want to give weapons to the opposition, there and abroad, all over the world. They're afraid of that, and they don't want to create civil war. They don't want, so they're cautious and they're careful. And this is true of taking over factories also, which is the other problem that's impeding progress. Construction factories don't want to construct for the poor. So the absence of a vision of the media means that you're sort of stuck just letting it sit there. Now, I don't know whether this makes sense, but suppose our vision for the media said, look, free speech isn't the 2% of the population should own the media, stuff it full of people who have their views, and stick it down everybody's throat every day. That's not free speech. Free speech is that the people should be able to manifest their diverse views through the media, including dissident views. And in Venezuela, that means anti-Chavez views. Okay, fine. So what if the Bolivarian Revolution had said, well, the media needs to be turned over to the people, but we need to protect a reasonable number of anti-Chavez voices in the media. That's what free speech is about. Those views need to be represented. But it is not the case that the media needs to be owned by a private group and administered in a way which doesn't reflect the will of the populace. And here's how we'll move toward that. Then I think maybe it would have been 60-40 or 70-30. So just like the absence of an understanding of what our vision is for, say, a workplace, getting rid of the division of labor, not just the ownership, dealing with markets, not just ownership and income, interferes with our ability to create structures that reflect our values and to create structures which inspire as compared to structures which are well motivated but don't quite cut it, don't quite make it. I suspect the same may be true around media in Venezuela. I just want to say in closing, I've been to Venezuela a few times. I've spoken with a number of people in Venezuela. I don't see how I could exaggerate the importance of what is going on there. I'm not saying that I am sure that it's going to succeed. I'm not. I am not sure that it won't be crushed, but I think it won't be. And I'm not sure that it won't devolve internally, but I think it won't. But I know for a fact that right now in the world, what's going on in Venezuela is one of the most hopeful and most important, and perhaps the most hopeful and the most important, alongside Bolivia, phenomena that's occurring. And so what implication does that strategically have for us? Well, I think it has one. Because it seems to me that one of the biggest obstacles, one of the biggest threats, in fact, the biggest obstacle and the biggest threat to Venezuela and to anything good pretty much anywhere in the world is us. It's the United States, the world's foremost, by an order of magnitude, rogue state, the foremost purveyor of violence, the foremost purveyor of reaction. And so the implication for us is to try and learn about, understand what's going on, and much more importantly, communicate with others about what's going on. So that when and if the Mideast no longer diverts the U.S. government from its own backyard and from what is, I think, a much bigger threat to the United States, that is what's going on in Latin America, and the United States begins to pull out all stops to repress what's going on and to subvert what's going on, we are prepared to fight on the side of the people of Venezuela. We should prepare to be able to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, our next speaker is going to be Noam Chomsky. Just 1 minute before he speaks, I just want to continue on Michael's last thought, which is the one about becoming informed. And for that, I just want to recommend something that just so happens that I work on the website venezuelaanalysis.com, so that's one possible source you could turn to. So I just want to encourage you to take a look there, venezuelaanalysis.com. Also, I have written about Venezuela, and you can find a lot more information there too. Anyway, our next speaker doesn't need much of an introduction, Noam Chomsky, and I'm sure, I'm literally looking forward to his talk, because I don't think he gets that many opportunities to talk on this particular topic. Thank you.
Well, I hate to disappoint you, but I'm not going to say much about this particular topic. Actually, I really came to listen, not to talk, so I've been listening. And I'll say a couple of words, but won't talk for long, so we can go straight into a discussion with people who do have something to say about this topic. I was struck in listening by two things. I mean, one, the theme that Mike just mentioned, that the United States, U.S. power is probably the most likely obstacle to positive developments taking place in Latin America and elsewhere. And the other, by more or less the opposite, that the kinds of ideas that were expressed and examples that were commented on are really very close to the surface in American history, both in popular culture and even in intellectual culture. They're kind of right there. They're sort of suppressed. You don't see them, but I don't think it takes much to evoke them. And they keep coming out because they're part of people's consciousness. There's tremendous efforts to repress them, but it doesn't take a lot for them to appear. So, for example, take the effort to eliminate wage labor in favor of participation in the workforce. I mean, the North American soldiers, the Northern soldiers during the Civil War fought under that banner. They were opposed to slavery, but they were also opposed to wage labor. In fact, they didn't see much difference between it. Abraham Lincoln made a distinction between slavery and wage labor. The distinction was that slavery is permanent and wage labor is temporary. So you can escape it and become a free person, free man in the times, in the thinking of the day. So yes, we have to fight against slavery, which is the worst form of domination and authority, because you can't get out of it. Wage labor is essentially the same thing, with the different with the property that you can get out of it. Now, this wasn't just Abraham Lincoln. It was the general conception. So, for example, here in eastern Massachusetts, where the Industrial Revolution began, the factories, the employees in the factories were young women from the farms, what are called factory girls. Artisans, Irish artisans from downtown Boston, where the maybe average life expectancy of a male was maybe 20 years or something like that, miserably treated. And the media were pretty much what Mike described. It's the period in the United States of the freest media. There was a great proliferation of media written by people themselves, not owned by anybody, no editors. The factories had their media, ethnic communities had their media, working people had their media, other groups had media, and they were very rich and, in fact, high culture. There wasn't that kind of distinction between high culture and popular culture. One of the complaints of working people in the mills, as they expressed in their own media, was that the industrial system was destroying their culture, their intellectual culture, which they were deeply immersed in. It was also destroying their personal integrity. It was taking away their liberty. It was turning them into sort of cogs in a machine who act on command. And they took it for granted, as they put it, that those who work in the mills should own them and should eliminate hierarchy and domination. And in fact, that spread substantially. In the main industrial center at the time was Pittsburgh, steel mills and so on. It was practically a working class revolution. I mean, towns were taken over, people ran their own, participated in the governing of their own communities. Homestead was the most famous case. It didn't survive, but it had to be destroyed by extreme violence. In Homestead, the main free town, where they also incidentally overcame racism. There was tremendous racism at the time, not just white-black, but also against Eastern Europeans, immigrants, and so on. It was almost entirely overcome in the course of these popular struggles. Well, it was necessary to bring in the army. It was destroyed by private security forces, Pinkertons, and the Pennsylvania National Guard, on the orders of a famous pacifist, Andrew Carnegie, who was established the first billion-dollar corporation by making ships for the U.S. Navy, and chicanery and the political system. So he went off to Scotland and made sure that his manager brought in military force to destroy it. And it wasn't so easy. I mean, they did destroy it, but it's come back. These ideas are just standard in popular culture. It takes two things to suppress them. One is force, and the other is propaganda. And in fact, as progress was made in gaining in reforms, in extending the franchise, in making it possible to organize unions without them being, massacred, as these developments took place, there was a shift in means of coercion and control from just plain force. The United States happens to have a very violent labor history, far worse than other industrial countries. And that goes right into the late 1930s when workers were being killed on strikes. But there was a shift from force to what was called engineering of consent, to methods to control people's attitudes and beliefs. In fact, that's the origins of the public relations industry. It grew basically in the 1920s in the two freest countries in the world, Britain and the United States. And it grew because of conscious awareness that the capacity to control people by force is declining. So we have to do other things. We have to turn them to consumerism, to what we call the superficial things of life, like frivolous consumption, which atomizes people, separates them from one another. And we have to control their beliefs, so you get huge propaganda institutions. When the franchise really extended, at least theoretically, to most of the population, women too, in the 1920s, was the beginning of efforts which have now become highly sophisticated to eliminate elections. When Obama was elected, as maybe you know, the advertising business, the PR industry which runs elections, gave him, each year they give an award for the best marketing campaign of the year. He got it. And the executives who were quoted in the business press were really happy. They said, we've been marketing candidates like commodities for a long time, but particularly since Reagan. And this is the greatest achievement we have. It's going to change corporate culture in the boardrooms. People are going to mimic this approach to marketing candidates. That's the way they're going to market other things. And the elections are run by the industry in such a way as to remove issues and focus on what are called qualities or values, like body language, or is he a nice guy, or something like that. Actually, I sometimes torture myself by listening to NPR when I'm driving. I happened to be listening once right after one of the Clinton-Obama debates, and they were interviewing the political columnist for the New York Times, whose name I've forgotten. And I listened for about 10 or 15 minutes, and there was one topic under discussion. Apparently at the beginning of the debate, when the two of them walked in, Obama held a chair for Clinton to sit on. And the question was, what was his body language? Was it deferential, black boy, white lady, or was it condescending, big man, little woman? And that was the discussion. Now, it's not that the population wants that. It's a very heavily polled society. We know what people want. But an overwhelming majority, they want issues discussed. But the advertising business, which runs the campaigns, knows that that's an extremely bad idea. And it's a bad idea for the reasons that I mentioned before. People have the wrong attitudes on issues. There's a huge gap between popular opinion and public policy. Both parties are well to the right of the population on a host of major issues, so you have to keep them out. Well, that's good for people like us. That means there'll be a great country in which to organize. On issue after issue, most of the people on your side. And things like eliminating wage labor, because it's not that different from slavery, or the idea that the people who work in the middle own it and run it, that's not far below consciousness. And it keeps coming out. In the last major economic crisis, the 1930s, there was a lot of progressive legislation. It was forced by working class activism, mainly, primarily the organization of the CIO. And the organization of the CIO came very close to a revolution. The crucial moment was sit-down strikes. When you have a sit-down strike, that's like 5 minutes before the working people in the factory doing what Mike was talking about. Why are we sitting here unemployed? Why don't we take over the factory and run it and kick out the bosses? Sit-down strike is very close to that, and it was very threatening. Also, the organization of the unions, the unions are a democratizing force. They bring people together. They let poor people pool their resources, think, talk to each other, make plans, enter the political arena, press for those demands, and so on. And that's threatening. And the business world was very upset about it. They talked about what they call the hazard-facing industrialists in the growing political power of the masses. They're kind of vulgar Marxists, so you get this kind of terminology all the time. Basically, Marxist values reversed. So they're worried about the hazard-facing industrialists and the rising power of the masses, and recognize that force is no longer working the way it used to, so we have to fight the everlasting battle for the minds of men with new techniques and devices. And in those days, what were called scientific methods of strike breaking, which have since become an enormous business. But there is a constant class war going on, very self-conscious, very understood, to try to beat back these feelings and attitudes which are just below the surface. And interestingly, the ones that are in the popular culture are not very different from the ones in the intellectual culture, the traditional intellectual culture, not the one that's taught in the schools, but the heroes that they're supposed to revere but not read. Like, say, people like Adam Smith, who was bitterly opposed to division of labor. He harshly condemned division of labor. When you take a course in economics or something, you read the first paragraph of Wealth of the Nations, which everybody can quote about, the butcher does this and the baker does this and everybody's happy. We need division of labor. But not many people go on for a couple hundred pages where he says that division of labor will turn people into the most stupid and ignorant creatures that a human being can possibly be, because a person's consciousness and understanding comes out of the kind of work they do. And if people are just doing rote work, they'll become robots. And since he's a creature of the Enlightenment, he believed in equality. In fact, one of his arguments for markets, his main argument, is that under conditions of perfect liberty, they'll lead to perfect equality, he meant equality of outcome. You can question the argument, but that was the goal taken for granted. So we don't want people to be as stupid and as ignorant as a human being can be, so therefore in any civilized society, the government must intervene, and the democracy means the population must intervene to prevent division of labor. Now, these ideas are right at the core of the intellectual culture. One of the great founders of classical liberalism, roughly at the same time, inspired Wilhelm von Humboldt, regarded wage labor as such an atrocity. This is classical liberalism, its core. Such an atrocity that he said, well, the way he put it, kind of poetically, he said, if an artisan produces a beautiful object on command, we may admire what he did, but we despise what he is, namely a creature who's like a robot, following orders and doing it very well, like a machine could do something very well. These are basic ideas of the intellectual culture. They're right in the popular culture, and they keep reviving. So, for example, just a month ago, there was a sit-down strike. These kinds of things happen in times of crisis. People start to think and get agitated. It was in Chicago, Republic, windows and floors, small factory. The owners were going to move it somewhere. The workers didn't want to. They wanted to save their community and the workplace. So there was a sit-down strike. Well, they didn't win everything, but they won something. The factory wasn't moved. It was sold to another corporation which agreed to meet workers' demands, whether they will or not, we'll see. But that's the kind of threat that really is, it does put the fear of God into state power and economic power. And it's about 30 years ago in Pittsburgh again, near Pittsburgh, in Youngstown, center of the steel industry, there was a major effort which ultimately failed, but was quite striking and could have succeeded with more support, outside support, union support, popular support. That was in Youngstown, the major steel industry where the owners wanted to move it, get rid of it. And the working people in the town, which was all, the city, which was all built around the industry, insisted on keeping it. There were demonstrations, take over corporate buildings, sitting in on the factory and so on. Well, the method that they used to try to do it, maybe it was the only one available, was to go to the courts and ask for a change in management structure, to introduce management by what are called stakeholders, meaning working people in the community. So the working people in the community would take over the plant and run it. It lost in the courts, naturally, but could have been done. It's very close to being done. And these are the reasons why you have constant, unending efforts to control people's thought, to control their attitudes, to attack organizations that might contribute to democratization and the implementation of the ideas that are not very far from consciousness. History of unions is a perfectly good example. In fact, we just saw a rather striking example of how all this works just a few weeks ago. The new president, Obama, decided to demonstrate his solidarity with working people. So he went to Peoria, Illinois, to an industrial plant and gave an inspiring talk about how he loves working people. Well, the plant he picked was Caterpillar. Now that aroused protests from human rights and church groups. And the reason is because Caterpillar produces weapons of mass destruction. It's these huge Caterpillar bulldozers who are wiping out the olive groves, the fields, the towns, and so on in occupied Palestine. So it did arouse protest. But there was another crucial element which was never protested, because propaganda has been so powerful, it's been driven out of people's minds. You'll recall that during the Reagan's term opened with the firing of flight controllers. What are they called? Patco. Yeah, Patco. They were on strike. He threw them out, and he brought in scabs. Well, that's pretty unusual. But Caterpillar, a couple of years later, was the first industrial plant in generations to break a major strike by bringing in strikebreakers. Now, there's no country in the world, with one exception at that time, where that's permitted. The exception was South Africa. And now the United States is alone. But they broke the strike, bringing in strikebreakers. A major event that hadn't happened in generations. And that was in Caterpillar. But there was no protest over that. In fact, most people didn't know about it. That reveals the success in the everlasting battle to take over, to win the minds of men. And it's the kind of thing that has to be combated. But I won't say any more, except just to say that I think Greg opened, in fact, by saying that in a condition of crisis, lots of things can happen. And one of the things that can happen is that the conceptions and the ideas that are just below the surface that keep springing up have to be beaten back, if not by force, then by massive propaganda, advertising, and so on. These things can come out, and the population is basically ready for them. I mean, as I mentioned, the attitudes and beliefs are well to the left of the party. About 80% of the population thinks the government doesn't work for the people, it works for a few big interests looking out for themselves. The place ought to be an organizer's paradise. You know, you really don't have to convince people of things that seem exotic. You have to just help them get to the point where they can bring out what they really believe and what is barely hidden. The examples of the wave that's taking over Latin America, which is the most exciting place in the world now, can be an inspiration, though it's necessary to let people understand what's happening. And there's massive efforts to prevent that. But they're not, it's not that they can't be overcome. There have been victories in the past, but there could be more now.
Okay.